Hello and welcome, my friends. It's your main man, Sultan Skinny, scholar of all that's lean and politically unclean. When researching my Muhammad episode, I came across a video called The Origin of Islam, in which Tom Holland talks about the historically true story of Muhammad. But instead of Spiderman, we get this guy. Holland is a British historian who has written multiple books on classical history, particularly specializing in the empires of Rome, Greece, and Iran. But because the Islamic Empire would come to conquer all of these other civilizations, he is interested in how this came to be. In his book, In the Shadow of the Sword, Holland wants to tell you the story of not only the origins of Islam, but also the end of classical antiquity. How did the barbarous Arabs conquer the most powerful empires of their day? What happened to the Romans and Persians that once ruled the world? Where did this new religion of Islam come from? A very interesting premise. So interesting that I decided to read his entire book and leave you guys a link in the description below. In his book, Holland doesn't tell you the story that Muslims and most historians would tell you about Muhammad. Instead, Holland challenges the mainstream story, claiming that Muhammad and the origins of Islam begin not in the city of Mecca, but somewhere in the deserts of Palestine. Many have spoken out against Holland, calling his work irresponsible and unreliable. But many have also praised his book as genuine scholarship. His documentary alone has over 1 million views, and his lectures hundreds of thousands. But reading his book and watching his videos was frustrating for your Sultan, to say the least. Not because he misrepresents the story of Muhammad or straight up lies to his audience about Arabian history. No, it's not that. What really bothers me about this guy is that with all the information he had and knows of, he still did not #remember Yemen, even after I asked him nicely to do so on multiple occasions. And because of that, I, Sultan Skinny, will show you, my dear viewers, why Tom Holland is wrong about Islam. So, Tom Holland will tell you himself that he is by no means an expert on Islam. Rather, he is approaching the religion's history by talking about things he already wrote books about, being primarily the imperial history of Iran and Rome. You see, Holland doesn't trust Islamic scholarship for several reasons. For one, it's written by Muslims who are inherently religious and use things like God and angels to explain winning battles and creating empires. Which is fine to believe in if you're Muslim, but what if you're a secular historian like Holland? What sources should we use to explore an authentic secular history of Islam? Well, obviously, we use the writings of Christian monks, Jewish rabbis, and Zoroastrian kings. Yes, instead of relying on the religiously biased scholarship of Muslims, Holland instead references passages from the Quran, along with other religious texts of those oh-so secular monks and bishops of the Christian Byzantine Empire. Seems pretty legit. Why use the scholarship of Muslims to explain Islam when we have so many other religions that can do it for us? Sounds like secular scholarship to me. As great as that logic sounds, the best reason for why Holland does not trust Islamic historians is because around the time Muhammad is said to have existed, there survives very little writing done by Muslims. Holland points out that the earliest inscription of Muhammad's name was written in the 690s AD on the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. That's 60 years after Muhammad is said to have died. The earliest surviving biography of Muhammad that we have today was written nearly 2 centuries after the guy's death. Well, why is that, Holland asks? That's a bit sketchy, don't you think? And I agree with him. That is sketchy. You know who else has a sketchy biography? Alexander the Great, whose earliest surviving biography was written nearly 300 years after his death, by Diodorus. But Tom doesn't seem to mind mentioning him in the book. Why is that? Well, I guess the key word here is surviving. As in, there were probably many texts written about Alexander before they got lost due to the burning of a particular library. In that case, he gets a pass, but the Muslims don't really seem to have an excuse here. It's not like they had a super big library that got burned down. It is because of Holland's secular principles and the lack of Islamic literature during Muhammad's time that leads him to conclude that if we are to understand the origin of Islam, we have to understand the world it came from. If we look at the Near East before Islam, we find a world rich in religious innovation. the weakening of empires, and the use of Arabs as mercenary forces, similar to how the Gauls and the Germans were used in the Western Roman Empire. And we all know how that turned out. It is from the things that Holland already knows about in history that he can paint a picture of a time where the basis of Islam as a religion, culture, and state was already being developed outside of Arabia. All it took was the will of a single man to lead the Arab armies and realize this new religious revolution. Holland doesn't deny the existence of Muhammad, he just has some questions regarding his past. His three main questions that drive the book's story are as follows. 1. Why is Islamic literature so late in writing Muhammad's story? 2. How do we know Mecca was the city where Islam got its debut? And 3. Where did the Quran get its biblical stories from? It is from Islamic sources being unable to answer these three unknowns that Holland bases his entire thesis on. By discrediting Islamic scholarship as non-secular and unreliable, Holland turns to the works of Orientalists like Patricia Crone and Fred Donner, essentially recycling their research and theories into his book. With his secular approach to Islamic studies, Holland comes to the conclusion that Muhammad and the origin of the Quran come not from the city of Mecca, but rather from the deserts of Palestine, where all the Abrahamic action is known to happen. Which honestly is a pretty solid thesis and a cool idea to consider. If you're going to ignore Islamic historians and only use the secular history of Christian Romans and Jewish rabbis, it makes sense that the Abrahamic religion of Islam got its debut where the other two got it. The only real problem this thesis has is the fact that it's wrong. And it's by answering Holland's three questions and observing the way he frames them that we can see why this is the case. Let's start with the first unknown to Holland's book. Why was Islamic literature so late in writing Muhammad's story? Well, there are three main reasons for why it took the Arabs nearly a century to start writing down proper historical accounts. For one, they were kind of busy carving the largest empire of their day. You see, the Arabs were a little bit more concerned making history than they were writing about it. Fighting the two largest empires of your time with a people who can hardly conceptualize the concept of a nation is something I assume at least would take some time. Second, after the establishment of the caliphate, there were a number of succession crises and civil wars that took place. These fitnas would not only make it a difficult time to write anything down as the state is literally ripping itself apart, but these conflicts also held in jeopardy the narrative of which Islamic history would be told in. But above all, the biggest reason it took a while for proper Muslim accounts to be written has to do with the Arabic language itself. Under the banner of Islam, the Arabs for the first time in their history united as a single force, following the one book of the one God whose message can only be recited in the one language, Arabic. But you see, there was no single Arabic language at this time, let alone a comprehensible Arabic script that all Muslims would have to learn to read. Prior to Islam, the Arabs had a wide variety of different dialects and scripts that would usually take influence from other existing languages, such as Aramaic, Himyaritic, and even Latin. The Arabic that Muhammad spoke and that the Quran was originally written in is not the same Arabic that later Islamic historians and scholars would write in. Classical Arabic as a language with grammar, a standardized vocabulary, and an official script only came into existence during the Umayyad dynasty, around the time Holland cites the first inscription of Muhammad's name. So on top of conquering the most powerful empires of their day and dealing with their own tribal drama, the Arab Bedouins had to completely manufacture a new language in order for their empire and religion to spread and stabilize. But for the sake of Tom's argument, let's pretend that doesn't matter and jump into the real crux of his thesis, which is these next two questions. Now before I continue, it is worth mentioning that Tom Holland is a pretty smart guy. If you read his book, you will see that the man has a very good understanding of the classical world and its history. But you see, that's the problem. Holland knows what he is talking about, so he then knows what to leave out and what to say in order for his thesis to work. The wording and information Holland gives us regarding these next two questions are designed to provide points for his argument, not inform the reader of Islamic history. This misrepresentation of Islamic history can be seen in how he tackles these next two questions. Holland asserts that the city of Mecca can't be the birthplace of Muhammad and therefore of Islam for several reasons. First, other than one or two references in the Quran, there are no written accounts about the city until the Umayyad dynasty. He says this as if written accounts determine whether or not a physical city actually exists. This point is redundant because the city of Mecca does exist, whether or not people write about it. Just because the literate Greeks or Romans knew little to nothing of Mecca doesn't mean that the city doesn't exist, or wasn't an important place to the Arabs. Holland seems to suggest that a person from Rome is more of an authority of Arabian history than the Arabs themselves. You know, the people the Arabian Peninsula is named after. But to be fair to Holland, he does cite an Islamic source to back his claim about Mecca. On page 198, being the secular historian that he is, he cites on multiple occasions the same passage from the Quran, 699, in which pomegranates, olives, and vineyards are discussed. Holland's takeaway from this is, well, Mecca is a desert city. Those things grow in the Mediterranean. Why is Muhammad describing a city with rich agriculture? Surely he must be in Palestine where those things can grow. But the verse itself is not describing the nature of a city, as it is so much describing the nature of God. Here's the verse in its entirety, which is something Holland won't show you in his book. And it is he who sends down rain from the sky, and we produce thereby the growth of all things. We produce from it greenery, from which we produce grains arranged in layers, and from the palm trees of its emerging fruit are clusters hanging low, and gardens of grapevines and olives and pomegranates, similar yet varied. Look at its fruit when it yields and its ripening. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who believe. It is also worth mentioning that Muhammad would not have spent much of his life in Mecca anyway. You see, when you are a nomadic Arab Bedouin, let alone a caravan merchant, much of your time is spent moving around from place to place, finding food and water, something that Mecca generally lacks. And just like modern Saudi Arabia today, most of the food Meccans would be eating was imported from somewhere else. He probably would have been made more aware of these foods too once he moved to Yathrib, which is another important detail that Holland enjoys leaving out of the story, as most of his focus is centered around Mecca being the birthplace of the Quran, ignoring the fact that much of the Quran was also revealed in Medina, the city of the Prophet. It is in Medina, not Mecca, that Muhammad founded the first mosque, and where the Muslims as a community would truly start to manifest themselves as a new religious force. Year 1 on the Islamic calendar begins when Muhammad leaves Mecca, but Holland can't tell you this, because his whole thesis revolves around Mecca and this notion of the city being the birthplace of Islam. Now we get to what is by far the biggest question of Holland's book, which alone holds more value and focus than anything else we covered thus far. On page 184, he writes, Mecca, so the biographies of the Prophet teach us, was an inveterate pagan city, devoid of any Jewish or Christian presence, situated in the midst of a vast, untenanted desert. How else then are we to account for the sudden appearance there of a fully fledged monotheism, complete with references to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, if not as a miracle? This exact question repeats itself numerous times throughout Holland's book and videos, as it is really his strongest point that provides justification for his conclusion. It is also the biggest flaw in the entire book, as it shows just how disingenuous and false Holland's theory is. You see, the question begins with a lie. Muslim sources do not tell you that Mecca was an exclusively pagan city, devoid of any Jews and Christians. In fact, they will tell you the complete opposite. Muslim historians and scholars would have you believe that Mecca was in fact a melting pot of different religious groups from across the ancient world, where everyone was welcome to worship their deity of choice around the Kaaba. There were even pictures of Jesus and the Virgin Mary in the Kaaba, at least according to this guy. Although the Arabs may have been mostly pagan, monotheism in Arabia wasn't a foreign concept. The notion that Mecca would have been too far away from any monotheistic influence is a straight up lie that even Holland doesn't believe himself. The dude starts his book talking about the Jewish king of Himyar, Yusuf Asser Yathr, who is infamous for persecuting the Christians of Najran, a city that's further away from Palestine than Mecca is. But you see, in order for Holland's thesis to work, he has to lie about Arabian history, because he's trying to prove that Islam did not start in Arabia. So misrepresenting Islamic texts and stories are a must, no matter how low and untrue the statements are. On page 211, Holland discusses the Constitution of Medina as an early source of Islamic history. He dismisses the contents of the Constitution because it doesn't tell us where Muhammad and the Muslims came from, which is just a lazy argument. You're talking about a constitution, not a history book. Why would a peace treaty between the Arabs and Jews of Medina mention Mecca? On page 213, Holland takes this nonsense a little further, stating that the 3 Jewish clans mentioned by the historians are not featured anywhere in the Constitution of Medina. and thus there is no evidence of a Jewish presence in Medina. But if you were to look up the translation of the Constitution, you will find that it does refer to Jews on multiple occasions, completely contradicting Holland's claim that there are no Jews in the presence of Muhammad. Now, does the Constitution give us the specific names of the 3 Jewish clans? No. But why does it have to? It already associates the Jews with their allied Arab tribes, acknowledging their existence in the city. Whether or not the Jewish tribes are named doesn't change the fact that the Constitution of Medina is evidence of Muhammad being among Jewish people. But you see, it is by asking these specific questions and providing these misleading analyses that Holland bases his entire argument on. He knows that the Constitution mentions Jews, but he also knows that it doesn't mention the specific names and places he is looking for. By taking passages and stories out of context, Holland is able to control the narrative of his story while ignoring important details in the history. This misrepresentation becomes ever more blatant when Holland discusses the history of Yemen. Despite talking about the kingdom of Himyar within the first sentences of the book, Holland actually doesn't say much about Yemen's history. He won't tell you that the Arabs see Yemen as their homeland or that many of Muhammad's followers, soldiers, and scribers trace their origin to the Katani tribes of Saba. Instead, Holland devotes Yemen's history to small paragraphs that are used to dismiss the region's significance to the story of Islam. On page 144, Holland discusses the frankincense trade of Himyar, asserting that while at one point a very profitable market, sometime around the 4th century, all that had changed with the toppling of the pagan gods. Christ demanded no incense. The trade between Rome and the frankincense growers of Himyar had duly withered. Holland does not have a citation for this claim. In fact, I couldn't find anything to support that, other than a statement made on Wikipedia, which also had no citations. The thing about Christ demanding no incense is also just a straight up lie. Christians to this day still use incense during sermon. Frankincense was one of baby Jesus' birthday gifts. The idea that frankincense would stop being profitable because of Christianity just doesn't make any sense. On page 195, Holland talks about the Sabians, as they are referenced in the Quran as being people of the book. Now, homeboy Holland completely avoids talking about the Sabians of Saba. You know, the place and people Arabs claim descent from. They have a lunar calendar and the concept of one god. Yeah, instead, he wants you to think that these people are a mysterious bunch, and if they are going to be anybody in ancient Arabia, they would most likely be a people known as Manichaeans. These are the followers of Manichaeism, a Zoroastrian sect founded by a guy named Mani, who, fun fact, is considered the first communist and totally not a Sabian. Tom, buddy, my guy, really, did you even look up the word Sabian? Or did you think no one would notice such a blatant lie? Your own citation by de Blois doesn't even agree with you. De Blois logically associates the Sabian reference in the Quran with the Mandians, a fringe religious group from Iraq that are closely associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition. As being people of the book and the Arabic word for Mandians being Sabian, de Blois' theory is based on some solid ground. But de Blois is honest enough to make note that there is no trace of a hypothetical Median presence in 7th century Arabia, meaning that there is no evidence to suggest or even hypothesize that the Sabians mentioned in the Quran are anything Tom Holland says they are. As bad as citing a source that contradicts your own statement is, nothing demonstrates just how disingenuous Holland is as a scholar more than what he does on page 186, when he talks about the Sana manuscripts. Oh, what are the Sana manuscripts, you may ask? Well, just the oldest collection of Quranic texts ever found, which carbon dating places at around the middle of the 7th century, the era of the first 4 Rashidun caliphs, the successors of Muhammad that knew him personally. These texts are so old that they're not even written in classical Arabic, but instead the Hijazi script, the same dialect that the people of Mecca and Medina would have spoken. These Quranic documents are so old that some pages have been erased and rewritten on top of because what the Quran would eventually be was still under the works. The closest thing to a blueprint of the Quran lies not in the deserts of Palestine, but the great mosque of Sana, Yemen, one of the oldest mosques in the world. Surely to our friend Tom, this must mean something, right? Wrong. Holland dismisses this clear piece of evidence because a German guy who read the manuscript described it as a cocktail of texts. Yeah, a cocktail of Quranic texts that contain full chapters of the book Muslims still read to this day. Tom throws in this quote as if it changes the fact that the Sana manuscripts are the oldest copies of the Quran and that they date around the same time Muslim historians say they would. But Holland doesn't want you thinking too hard about these texts because their existence dismantles his entire argument. In fact, Holland doesn't want you thinking at all when you are reading his book, because if you do pay attention and think critically, you realize that Holland's thesis doesn't actually make any sense. You don't even need to do much research. All you really need is a basic understanding of Islam, and you can see that Holland's thesis leaves us with more questions and confusion than the original story of Muhammad. If Islam was founded by Romanized Arabs based in Palestine, would it not make sense for these guys to make Jerusalem the holy city? Would it not be easier to jumpstart your religion and empire on something the people of the book already agreed on? If Islam started in the fertile lands of Palestine, why wouldn't they adopt a sun calendar like all the other cultures and religions that practiced agriculture? Why would they use a lunar calendar, something which only desert caravan traders would use? Why is the city of Medina called the city of the Prophet and home of the first mosque? Shouldn't the first mosque be somewhere in Palestine? Why does Yemen alone have not one but two mosques that predate the Dome of the Rock? Heck, you even have mosques in Africa, China, and India that predate the conquest of Palestine. If Palestine is where the Quran got its debut, then why are its oldest copies found in Yemen? If Islam didn't start in the Hijaz, why are the oldest Qurans written in the Hijazi script? If Islam, as a religion, started in Palestine in the first place, why would the Muslims lie to themselves and bother pilgriming to Mecca and Medina at all? You don't think they would rather visit the beautiful, fertile, holy lands of the Jordan River Valley instead of the hot, barren deserts of the Hijaz? Why would they do this to themselves? The truth is, no matter how many times Tom tries to twist the sources and history to be on his side of the argument, his conclusion lacks anything that really supports it in reality. The idea of Palestine being the birthplace of Islam becomes harder to believe than Muhammad's entire story. This guy Tom was supposed to give us answers, and instead he leaves us with more questions. How bad of a secular historian do you have to be when religious lore makes more sense than your thesis? If Islam had to start anywhere else other than Mecca, it would so clearly be Yemen. But Holland dedicates more time talking about Byzantine chariot racing than he does about the cradle of Arabian civilization. Forget not hashtag remembering Yemen, this guy is straight up ignoring it. Instead of trying to actually inform his readers on Islamic history, Holland spends his time not only trying to discredit Muhammad's story, but also intentionally erase Yemen's historical significance from the picture. All this to prove a theory that makes less sense than the 1600-year-old religion you were trying to debunk. You see, it's guys like Tom who keep people ignorant of Middle Eastern history. Not because he doesn't know any better, but because he would rather make fun of the region's most prominent religion and belittle the people who follow it.
Say the Quran did not originate from Mecca, or at least Mecca that we, in Saudi Arabia where it is now, where Muslims go on pilgrimage. Basically, they're going on pilgrimage to the wrong place, I think, is the implication. The traditional story is that a prophet emerges, he preaches a new religion, the Arabs erupt out of the desert, they've got the Quran in one hand, they've got the sword in the other. They're always sort of, that image, I always wonder how on earth did they then ride their camels if they were doing that.
Hilarious. Now, if anything is to be taken away from Holland's failure as a credible scholar, other than don't lie or cite sources that disagree with you, it should be hashtag remember Yemen. It is with this hashtag that we bring attention to this forgotten cradle of civilization, a place and people who to this day remain to be ignored by the rest of the world, no matter how influential they are or how loud they cry. If you are not gonna hashtag remember Yemen for its rich past or tragic present, at least do it so you can hashtag be better than Tom Holland. Next episode, we will discuss how Islamic civilization got itself so big to eventually fall so hard. We look into how the religion of Islam inherently provides the fuel to grow and destroy itself in such a radical manner. This is Islam, the good, the bad, and the ugly.